Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcast. And you are Elizabeth Spiers.
Spiers, actually.
How do you pronounce it?
Spiers.
Spiers?
Mm-hmm.
Shocking. I'm going to have to totally reassess you. Spiers. Okay, it's fine. I'm over it. You are the founding editor of Gawker.
Yeah.
And you have you've done other kind of startup stuff in the realm of journalism. You've written for the New York Times, for New York Magazine, and so on. Most relevant to our conversation today is the fact that you were the editor of the New York Observer, which means that you were working for Jared Kushner.
That is correct.
And this was in, 2012, for about like a year and a half, 2011? When was it?
Yeah, 2011, 2012 for 18 months, which hilariously made me the second longest running editor of the Observer at that point.
Huh.
But yeah, a year and a half.
So editors did not last long under Jared?
No, not so far anyway.
And by the way, does he, now he closed the print edition, has he sold the digital version yet?
No, I think it's on the block. They keep trying to sell it, but I don't know how well they are or aren't doing with that. So
okay, so we're going to talk about Jared from your distinctive vantage point. And then I hope we'll have time to talk about Gawker a little too in light of recent events. I mean, it wound up intersecting in a certain sense with the Trump campaign in the sense that well-known Trump supporter Peter Thiel sued it. And so killed it, more or less. This is, I guess Jared Kushner needs no introduction at this point. We all know who he is. Donald Trump's son-in-law, I don't know what his title is, special guy in the White House or whatever, but it's he has unusual proximity to Trump, and you had unusual proximity to him. Now, here's a question. Like, I think it's safe to say you have some views of him that are not altogether flattering. We may get to those, but let's start off on a positive note. Suppose, like, you were writing him a job recommendation and you wished him well, and you wanted to say whatever positive there was to be said.
Yeah.
What kinds of things would you say?
I mean, it's sort of strange because, I met him 2 weeks after he bought the Observer.
Oh, and when was that?
Later. That was in 2006.
Okay.
I had started a site called Deal Breaker that was a Wall Street gossip site. And at one point, the Observer had expressed interest in buying it, although this was after my time. But 2 weeks after he bought it, we had a conversation about maybe doing a partnership because the Observer had some Wall Street coverage, but not a lot. Mm-hmm. And I remember what he was like, in the very beginning. And he was sort of, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and excited about owning a media company, but had no experience in the field. And so by the time I was hired as editor-in-chief, I think longest-running editor of the Observer, Peter Kaplan, who'd been there for 17 years, had broken him in a little bit, and there were some, market changes. He seemed at the beginning of his tenure, and I'm referring to Jared, not Peter, excited about the prospect of jumping into something that he hadn't done before. So I would say, if I have to think of some nice thing to say about my experience working with Jared, it's that I think when he encounters new things, he goes in with a lot of confidence, which is both good and bad. He's unafraid.
Like peace in the Middle East, for example.
Exactly.
A new topic he goes into.
Let's not think about the past. Let's just see what's on the table now. So, that's good. I think, and he has a great work ethic. One thing that I can't say about him is that he's lazy. But I would say the work ethic is very narrowly directed because his range of things that he's curious about is very narrow. So,
like, what kinds of things is he curious about, and what kinds of things is he not curious about?
The New York Observer was a general interest newspaper. It covered business, politics, real estate, And it had a giant visual arts section, with a lot of culture coverage. And of those topics, the only pieces that I know Jared read were the real estate pieces.
Wow.
And I think that's sort of continued a little bit. I think he's interested in being in the White House because he's interested in the power it affords. I don't think that he's suddenly developed a serious intellectual affection for foreign policy issues.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't get any feedback from him basically on virtually anything except real estate pieces? I mean, the kind of feedback that owners give that is sometimes problematic, like they really care about this and they want you to know how they felt about this piece you wrote. That was basically, that was basically confined to real estate, unless it was somebody he knew or something.
It depends. For the first 2 months I had the job, Trump was technically running for president. This was in 2011, early 2012, I think. And he wasn't. Nobody was talking about him as a serious contender, but this is when he was pushing the birther stuff. Mm. So we were in a weird position where the politics desk had to talk about it. But we couldn't go out and profile Trump. Ivanka's a part owner of the paper. So we would aggregate things and just point to, here's what the Times said about him. But even that was controversial. Jared would call and would be angry that we'd linked to an unflattering profile of Trump in some mainstream outlet. And the problem was, you couldn't find a flattering profile of Trump because he wasn't doing anything to warrant it. And it was hard for, I think, Jared to wrap his head around that. It's like, look, your father-in-law goes out and does something positive that makes a lot of news. We're not going to avoid linking to it. But right now he's a walking disaster. I don't know what you want us to do. And so we did have several fights about that. And the weekend where we had the worst one, I called a mutual friend of ours and just to ask for advice. I said, Jared's getting so annoyed with any Trump coverage at all that I feel like he's on the verge of threatening to fire me, but I'm not going to go and commission positive Trump coverage. I don't think that's ethical. I also couldn't have asked, Observer reporters to do that, even if I were unethical. Because frankly, the Observer is not the kind of publication, or wasn't historically, that would attract journalists who'd be willing to do that. I would have had a raft of resignations on my desk if I had gone into the bullpen and demanded that. And the friend told me, he said, well, part of the problem here is that you're having a conflict of values, and Jared views this as a family loyalty issue. You view it as a journalistic integrity issue. And I said, that's exactly right, but here's the deal. Jared can walk around with his father-in-law angry at him for 24 hours. I can't throw my entire, all of my professional integrity in the toilet.
Right.
I said, so he may end up firing me. And if he had at that point, I would have been the shortest tenured Observer editor in its history. But he dropped out that Monday morning. And
Trump dropped out of the campaign?
That morning, the mutual friend texted me and said, well, you might not have anything to worry about anymore.
Yeah.
So then he was out of the picture and it wasn't an issue. But if Jared called me about something in the paper, it was almost always real estate related, or it would be some random story where the subject maybe knew him or had a connection to him and tried to call him to complain. So I would always hear him out, but I wasn't, we didn't retract stories because they called and complained.
Okay. Did you ever encounter Trump himself and or Ivanka in the course of your duties?
Ivanka, yes. I never met Trump in person. Our reporters dealt with him semi-regularly. With Ivanka, I wasn't around her that much. I had dinner at their house once, and we would see each other in passing at mostly Observer events. So I don't know her that well. I have some general impressions of her, but certainly not comparable to the extent to which I knew Jared. So,
and anything stand out about her among those limited impressions?
I've written a lot about this. I had a column in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago. She's very, when you think about how she grew up, she was in the spotlight from a really early age, and then she was a teen model. She's very conscious of how she's viewed externally and very aware of optics. So it's kind of like dealing with somebody who's been media trained from the time they were able to walk, where nothing comes out of her mouth that isn't designed for mass consumption on some level. But otherwise, she and Jared have a lot in common, and they're a lot alike. I think they're interested in the same things. They operate much the same way, and they have similar families. And then, they both grew up in households dominated by big, colorful, controversial father figures.
Who were both in commercial real estate and both seemed to have had their shady aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they bonded over it. I mean, I think that's a key to understanding their relationship.
Because, of course, Jared's father actually went to jail.
Yeah.
A pretty tawdry thing, and Chris Christie made the mistake of being the one who prosecuted him, which didn't bode well for his position in the administration. I'm kind of, in a sense, I'm surprised that you said Jared showed no interest in anything but the real estate, because he himself is not nouveau riche. I mean, his father was rich, and I think his father inherited the real estate business from his father. Isn't that right? So there was money that had been in the family a while by the time Jared comes along, and typically with those families, I mean, his father apparently paid real money to get him into Harvard. That's the story. Yeah. And usually you come up with somebody who wants to at least seem like they're interested in the arts, and they know the names of the artists, and they actually went to a show and so on. Did he at least have that? Did he at least sustain that appearance, or not?
Yes and no. I mean, I think he wants to be thought of as intelligent, if that means anything. But he never really had the natural curiosity to explore anything except commercial real estate. And, when you consider that, I think he was set up to run the family business from a very young age. And commercial real estate in New York is very small and insular and dynastic. You have a handful of families that sort of send the businesses down the generational lines. And so there was never certainly not a big professional impetus for him to be curious about other things. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also just a personality trait. I mean, I did one of the first cover stories I did was about Martin Amis moving to Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And the conceit of it, it was an Observer story, so there's always some underlying social commentary or, some of it's satirical. And so it wasn't really about Amos moving to Brooklyn. It was about creative class insecurity and what other writers would think about this and, what it means to be a writer in New York. So part of what I had the reporter do was go back over a power list of writers that the Observer had done several years prior that had been controversial. It was something like 50 most powerful writers in Brooklyn. And so, of course, in typical New Yorker fashion, people were annoyed that it was Brooklyn-centric. They were annoyed about who was on it and who wasn't on it. In fact, the reporter himself was annoyed that he hadn't been on it. So I had him call everybody on the list and ask them about.
Can you tell us who the reporter was? Or would you...
It was Christian Lorentzen. He's now at New York Magazine.
I've never heard of him, so he doesn't belong on the list. Go ahead.
He's a wonderful writer, and he probably should have been on the list. But he called everybody on the list. He ended up with a great long piece, and he ended up talking to Amos after much resistance on Amos's part initially. And that was the cover story. And Jared came up to me at a real estate event a few days later, and he said, what was the deal with that cover story? Why are we doing pieces on this guy? And I said, the Observer covers publishing, among other things. It's a small regional newspaper, but it covers people in power in New York-centric industries. So media and publishing get a lot of ink in the Observer. And he said, well, I just don't get it. I mean, nobody knows who Martin Amis is. And I said, yeah, they do, especially in New York publishing and, among the kind of people who subscribe to the Observer. I said, I think it's more that you don't care about Amos because you don't read novels. And he proceeded to explain to me that that was correct and that it was a waste of time. And this is the sort of, but it's not just he doesn't read novels. He doesn't read long form nonfiction either, unless there's some, status attached to it. If there's a book that everybody's been seen reading, he might try to take a crack at it. But he's not the kind of person who enjoys learning for its own sake.
Okay. So before he went into the White House, he had no evident interest in public policy, domestic or international.
No, I think he was interested in influencing local politics, but for different reasons. You could always draw a line from whatever the apparent temporary interest was to something that affected Kushner Co. as a business. Mm-hmm. The only time I saw him courting local politicians here and there, but there was always a zoning issue or something that affected commercial real estate in some way. I didn't really see him take an interest in anything else politically.
So he didn't even seem conversant particularly, or particularly interested in national politics, let alone policy, but even the kind of horse race politics.
Yeah.
No. So, it's funny. Pictures of him are remarkably consistent. The way he looks in the pictures. Now, I don't know if that's because of like photo editor bias. They want him to look a certain way, or he really often looks that way. But it's, he's rarely smiling. He looks kind of distant and cool. If you just showed me one of these pictures and I had no idea who he was, I'd think, he looks like a cool, calculating guy who's probably one step ahead of me right now, right? He projects that kind of aura, at least in these still photos of him.
This is also a function of framing. You're seeing him against the backdrop of an administration filled with crazy people who are over the top. So by comparison, Jared probably does look like the smartest guy in the room, but that says something about the room. Also, I think when Jared's not a quiet person, but because he doesn't talk on the record to reporters very often, you haven't seen him on camera very often, and when you do, he's in the background. It gives the impression that he's quiet and reserved, and I think people tend to project intelligence and gravitas onto men who seem quiet and reserved. If he were a woman, he would be aloof, but that's a whole different issue. So in order to look intelligent, all he has to do is keep his mouth shut, not do anything overtly crazy, and don't go on the record with the press very much, all of which he's done,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you said he doesn't have very broad intellectual interest, to put it mildly, but what about just plain old smarts? In other words, when he is engaged in something he cares about, like the New York Observer or real estate, and you're talking about like that, like, do you have to explain things to him 3 times, or is he actually pretty sharp?
No, he's not dumb, but he's not, he's kind of unremarkable. He's a C student who got into Harvard. Yeah. Good educational credentials. He can put a sentence together, but, I think we all know people who are above average intelligence. And I think if he had applied for a job in the Obama administration, nobody would be looking to him for smart analysis of anything, because he wouldn't stand out. He would be so catastrophically and obviously underqualified to be there. So again, everything's relative. It's, is he smart? It's like, well, compared to who? Yeah. Maybe compared to Trump. I would argue that he's smarter than Trump is, but that's...
Well, that's interesting, because there's a big debate over that, and I'm more or less with you. I think Trump has never been all that smart, and that's why I don't think we've seen really clear cognitive decline that's unusual for a person that age. He's just never been all that articulate, and he's not all that smart, and he's got a kind of instinct for pleasing a crowd, and then he came along at this moment when the stuff he says resonates. But is that kind of your take on Trump as well?
Yeah, well, I like to tell people that I think of him as a human A/B test, where he responds to the last best response that he got that mobilized people or people reacted well to. And there was someone who knew him growing up who told me at one point that she thought that reaction really came from his relationship with his father, Fred Trump, who was kind of abusive to him. And so when Trump was younger, he would just try every conceivable form of message to get, dad to calm down and not be angry with him, or, be more affectionate. And so he would throw everything against the wall, and then just whatever worked, he would double down on it. And that sort of, as a pattern, that seems to be what he does now. If he gets a good reaction to something, he uses it again until he stops getting a good reaction. And it's why he's, wildly inconsistent in what he says. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have any core values or principles. He's just looking for a short-term bounce. So
yeah, sometimes you can kind of see him almost doing the A/B testing. He'll say something, and it won't work with a crowd, and he'll kind of go, at least some people say that or something. He'll kind of back off. Yeah. You can see him backing off of it.
Yeah.
So, what about, well, would you say that Jared himself, you said that Trump has no real values. Would you say that Jared has values?
I thought that he did when I was working for him, although I didn't think they were very pronounced. I didn't think that most of his decision-making was built around them. But I was sort of floored, not even sort of, I was floored that when Jared and Ivanka went beelining to Washington, that they were able to support and enable policies that, as I knew them in New York, they would be horrified by. So now I'm convinced that they're kind of just nihilists. I'm not sure that they have any real values, or at least in as much as they have them, they value, their own sort of mores, but less than they do the power and status that the office affords them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they would argue, or somebody in their defense would argue, that they're they got to pick their spots. They're doing what they can to hold the line, and they obviously are going to lose some, and they have to go along with those to blah blah blah. But you don't buy that.
No, I think we've seen no evidence of it. We have a lot of quotes from people close to Jared and Ivanka, i.e. Jared and Ivanka, saying that, they didn't approve of something that Trump did. But, have you seen them actually move policy in any direction? No. And so I also think people confuse the fact that they have Trump's ear with the notion that they can influence him. I don't think he's influenced by anybody at the end of the day, at least not on a consistent basis. He listens to them because they're family, but that doesn't mean that he takes their advice. I think they give him a certain level of personal validation just by sticking around and saying, we have your back no matter what. But that's, again, not the same as treating them as advisors.
And do you buy the fairly common view that what most energizes Jared about being in the White House, or one of the things it does, is the possibility that he can use his political influence, arguably unethically, to help his family business?
Yeah, I mean, I assume that's part of it. I know that from being around him, that he would already appreciate the extent to which a White House job would help him build his Rolodex and stuff it with A-listers he wouldn't be in the room with otherwise. But I think that's the end point for it. And, when you look at where the company is now, they have a $1.4 billion note due in February of next year on 666 Fifth Avenue, which is a Class A office building that they own. And when they bought it, it was the largest real estate transaction in history. A lot of people would argue that they catastrophically overpaid for it, and that's part of the problem now. But they need to find somebody to bail them out. And so it seems like, there are a lot of maybe circumstantial, but meetings and deals that just don't look good with that in mind or with that in context. So, yeah, I would say I don't think that he's above using the office in that way.
Do people say he overpaid even for the time? I mean, we know he had the misfortune of buying that building right before a real estate crash, but are people saying even at that moment, if you didn't, even assuming you didn't know about the crash, you just could have gotten a better deal?
Yeah, it wasn't just the crash. It was a highly prestigious building, and I think that was part of their motivation in buying it. I think, this was after Charlie Kushner had gotten out of prison, And buying that building was a way of, putting a stake in the ground in Manhattan commercial real estate and saying, look, we're big players, we're back. The problem is some of it's the building itself. It's a beautiful building, but there are some architectural features it has that are outdated. Like the ceilings are a little bit low. And these are things that you can't just bring in some contractors and fix. You can't raise every ceiling on every floor of that building. So even the Kushner's plans for rehabbing it include essentially, raising part of it and rebuilding it. And that's incredibly expensive to do. So in a way, the long-term way that they get a bailout is if somebody comes in and says, part of what we're going to do is make this building investable. So we have to change the features enough that it's attractive, and, make it more modifiable than it is. But their partner in the deal is a real estate company called Vornado. And I think Vornado would prefer to just knock the whole thing down and start over. So there's also some, disagreement about what to do with the building in the first place.
And as I recall, I mean, there's two kind of recent pieces of evidence that Jared is kind of misusing his powers. One is that a couple of people came into the White House, talked maybe policy, maybe talked getting a job, and then they later gave loans to that supported other properties of the Kushners. But the 666 building figures, I think, in the story where Jared's father sought a loan from basically the government of Qatar or its sovereign wealth fund or whatever. He was turned down, and a few weeks later, Jared is pushing the policy that Trump implemented of strongly supporting Saudi Arabia in its attempt to isolate Qatar. It was like, it seems to me like, of course, we'll never know whether that was punishment per se, but it's kind of hard to imagine that how Jared was going to come out on that issue had no correlation at all with whether Qatar gave his father the money or not, right? That's just almost impossible to conceive. So that is that building, right? 66 Fifth?
Yeah.
So, would you say, and was that mainly his father's deal, or that was as much his as his father's when they bought it?
It was as much Jared's. I mean, I do think his father's influence was a big factor, because I think Charlie viewed it again as a way to make their mark on commercial real estate again. But Jared's the president of the company at the time, so. And
you know more about this stuff than I do. Is their situation really acute? I mean, so the bill is due. They've got 1 year to come up with a bunch of money, which will be in the form of a loan. Does it look like exceedingly grim if he doesn't misuse his political power to get the loan?
I mean, I think that's the case, but the issue, the reason why none of us know is that the whole, they're a private company. They have disparate holdings all over the place. And when you look at how commercial real estate is structured, it's not always easy to parse who owns what and where. Each building is a separate LLC with a separate ownership structure, usually with multiple partners. So, I mean, one of the challenges of covering this administration is that you need a team of forensic accountants just to figure out what the Kushners own and what the Trumps own, and they're not publicly disclosing it. Trump hasn't released his tax returns. Jared has amended his financial statements several times. So we don't know. They're saying that 666 is a very small portion of their holdings, but we haven't seen any evidence to, document that. And given the sort of primacy of that deal when it was made, I'm a little skeptical that that's the case, because they were certainly pretty anxious when they needed to refinance it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what about Jared, as a boss, in the sense of how he runs things? Is he administratively capable? Does he what was he like as a workplace presence and as a manager and so on?
Yeah, so the structure with the Observer was, Jared's full-time job was running Kushner Co. out of 666. The Observer was in an entirely different building. I met with him once a week at 666, and we usually talked or emailed pretty much every day, but it's not like he was in the office. In fact, I usually I wanted him to not be in the office because he had a tendency to be condescending to the journalists on staff. And so,
and how did that manifest itself? I mean, what kinds of things would he do?
Comments he would make to them, his sort of tone with them was that, he was, writing their paychecks as an act of charity, even though everybody at the Observer was catastrophically underpaid, and mostly at the Observer because it had been a great writer's newspaper, and there are certain kinds of stories you can do there that, you couldn't do elsewhere. He would take credit for, there was a sort of narrative that he would repeat at every company event, which was, the Observer was dying and I rescued it, which I think because anybody who works at the Observer knew exactly what had happened with that sale, was hard to swallow. And he just generally didn't understand or appreciate the work that journalists do as a matter of course. He sort of thinks that if journalists weren't so fucking stupid, they would be working in commercial real estate and making a lot of money.
Right.
So it's also just not understanding why anyone would take a job or do a job for any reason other than making money.
Yeah. I remember once an academic said to me, he looked at me, we talked, we hadn't met that long before, but we were just talking about ideas and stuff, and he said, you could have been an academic. And I thought, every journalist I know would wonder why anyone who had that choice would be an academic. But it was that there are a lot of people outside of journalism who don't have a lot of respect for the field, I guess. So, yeah, I asked you, I put the question wrongly. I said, what kind of manager was he? He wasn't a manager. The reason I ask is because my own familiarity with owners of magazines consists largely of encounters with Marty Peretz when he owned the New Republic. I was acting editor of the New Republic for 7 months, and in that case, in fact, I think even when I think the entire time I was there, when Mike Kinsley was editor, when Andrew Sullivan was editor, when I was acting editor, I think the masthead said something like owner and editor in chief. He made no bones about it, and then the person actually running the magazine was called the editor. But the truth is, he weighed in consistently enough that it made sense in a way to just acknowledge that he had an editorial role. But Jared wasn't like that, it sounds like.
No. No, he had opinions on specific stories and particularly real estate stories. And then he would sometimes call and try to get something killed if he didn't like it, but we'd have a big negotiation. And when I took the job, I asked him how many stories he'd killed under my predecessor, and he said 2, which I knew was probably a lie. But I told him that if it was 2 over the course of a year, I could probably handle that. But if it went over 2, I'd probably have to quit. So every time he'd call and try to kill something, I would ask him, is this one of the 2? And normally he would back off because he wanted that, thing in reserve. So I didn't. So he, I'm not saying that he didn't try to influence publication, but I have a lot of stamina for debate, and I think after a point he would just get tired of arguing with me, and she's like, "Fine, we'll move on."
Did he ever kill his 2 stories?
I let him kill one tiny real estate item where it was something that I wasn't even sure we should be doing anyway, because it was just somebody nobody'd ever heard of, but happened to be an acquaintance of Jared's. And I also had a story in the pipeline at the time that I thought, I'm going to need some leverage when this one comes down because he's not going to like it. So yeah, I did let him kill one.
Mm-hmm. And so you finally, you wrote a while ago a Washington Post piece about why it included some stuff about why you resigned. The reason you resigned wasn't for any of the reasons we've mentioned, basically, right? You want to talk about why you finally resigned?
Yeah, I'd when I went to the Observer, I had admired it for a long time, and I sort of idolized Peter Kaplan, the longtime editor. So when Jared approached me, it's kind of like being asked to be the drummer in your favorite band, and then sort of not realizing that was ever an option. And so I was excited about the prospect of doing it, even though it would have been it was a pay cut for me. but I went in and I wanted to see what the finances were because I was well aware that the Observer had a habit of not paying freelancers and telling people they had no resources and that Jared didn't have a reputation for investing into the property. And so, I took a look at the books. I had conversations with Jared about what an investment into the Observer would look like. And we sort of came to an agreement that if I hit specific milestones, he would put more money into it. So I went there, I did what I could with what we had. I restructured some things, tried to grow the circulation, grow the web traffic. We launched a bunch of new web properties. And, year one's up and I've hit all my milestones. And we, in fact, had the first profitable quarter in the paper's history, which I can't entirely take credit for. The publisher, Christopher Barnes, gets that. But his response to that was, great, let's do some layoffs and then those margins will be better. And it's like, well, that was not what we talked about. We had talked about, we demonstrate in good faith that we can, grow this thing and ramp it up. Then the only way to keep scaling it is to actually invest in the company. So we went through a series of business plans that Christopher and I had put together and kept presenting to Jared, and he kept rejecting them with not enough specificity about why. And at some point, you just stop banging your head against the wall because you realize that he doesn't actually have any intention of putting more money into the Observer. He's just kicking the question, down the field. And I'm not a maintenance-oriented person. I like growing things and ramping them up. And I also was seriously concerned about the long-term stability of the thing. If you don't grow it, you don't expand it, you don't figure out how to build on the existing business model. I don't know that the Observer even works as a small regional. So I didn't want to stay there and just watch it run out of steam because we couldn't grow it and it was becoming less competitive every day in an already busy media environment. So I think I just, after I got the 6th business plan rejected, I went home that weekend and thought, is there any value in me staying here? And I thought the answer was no.
Mm-hmm. And, people who don't know the Observer should know that it had become a very cool thing. As you kind of mentioned. Now, how old was he when he bought it? Was he basically just out of college?
I think he was 24.
Yeah.
26 maybe.
So It came out on this pinkish orange paper, kind of like the Financial Times, right?
Yeah. Same paper, actually.
What?
It's the same paper, actually.
Kind of a salmon colored. Yeah. And it was this cool thing. When was it founded?
I want to say 84, maybe.
Yeah, so I was living in New York then, and it was this cool thing. There were 2 cool things going on. There was Spy Magazine, and there was The Observer, which was different. It was about, but they both had this kind of knowing air. And, of course, The Observer was more straightforwardly journalistic. It wasn't just satirical, but they both had this kind of knowing vibe, and so that's what he bought into.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly, the history of it was that for a long time, the guy who was the owner, Arthur Carter, had his lawyer be the editor-in-chief of it. And so in the Observer's early days, it was more like a community newspaper. Huh. But Graydon Carter, who had been the co-founder of Spy, was hired by Carter to be the editor of the Observer. And so he really gave it that satirical edge initially because he was replicating a lot of what they'd done at Spy. And then Carter left to go to Vanity Fair. Arthur Carter hired Peter Kaplan, who had been at, I think, Manhattan Inc. And so, and Peter really built out the publication where, the way that I think people remember it in its heyday.
That's funny. I didn't even realize Graydon Carter had been editor of the Observer when I mentioned Spy, but that makes sense. So, it seems like, it's just, as this Mueller investigation proceeds, it just seems like, leave aside the Russian collusion per se thing, and leave aside all that, and it just seems like they're just finding stuff and are bound to find stuff, a lot of just kind of shady, messy stuff that Trump is involved in, and perhaps that Jared is involved in. And there's there's two ways you can get into that kind of trouble. One is to be unethical to begin with, and the other is to be sloppy, right? Yeah. You can be unethical. You can get away with being unethical if you're not at all sloppy. But if you're unethical and sloppy, you're in trouble. And I'm convinced that Trump is both of those things, right?
Yeah, I think he I think he has been historically, and there's a long paper trail to document it. There's a reason why only one American bank would still lend him money when he went into this administration. He's had 4 bankruptcies. I mean, they're even just financially, there's a trail of messiness behind him.
And he doesn't. I mean, of course, he doesn't have to disclose much because it's not a publicly held company. But he doesn't do a very meticulous job of covering stuff up. I mean, supposedly didn't sign this NDA with the porn star, with Stormy Daniels. So my question is Jared? I take it. Well, first of all, am I reading you correctly? No, I guess you haven't actually said he's unethical. You've said he doesn't have a lot of core values. I guess so. The two questions are, A, do you consider him unethical or at least ethically loose enough to get himself into trouble? And B, is he sloppy enough so that there is likely evidence, if he was unethical in these ways, there is likely evidence lying all over the place?
Well, I would say, yeah, I do think he's ethically loose enough to do the things we're talking about. I think it's not just sloppiness, though. It's when you do these incredibly complex deals, they by nature of how they're conducted, there's always just a ton of paperwork and just overwhelming amount of evidence attached to any of it. Like these are not simple transactions, and that sometimes makes it hard for people to tease out what's actually happening. But on the upside, if you have people who are very good at doing that, there's probably no shortage of stuff to look at that's damning in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Was he, though, as a matter of fact, not as sloppy as Trump is in your estimation?
Yeah. Well, partly because I just think Kushner Co. is probably a little more professionalized. Trump org is all over the place. I'm sure there are competent people who work there, and there are also insane people who work there. Yeah. And I think for the most part, Kushner Co. is a lot more buttoned down. If they have smart people who work on their transactions, I don't think I would, if I had to bet on one versus the other, I would say that Kushner Co. is probably better lawyered and insulated than Trump org is. And
so he may not be as bad on sloppiness. By the way, does he have much of a sense of humor? One feature of the photos of him is that he's not. I've seen pictures where he was smiling, maybe even laughing, but you don't see many. Did he laugh much? Does he have a sense of humor?
Yeah. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't say it's a defining characteristic of his, but he's not completely flat. I mean, his sense of humor is pretty generic and a little frat boyish, but not. I understand why you would say that if you were just looking at the photos of him, because he is never smiling and he seems really dour. And I think that's also, again, a function of the way he wants to be perceived. He wants to be thought of as serious and intelligent, and doesn't want to be perceived as unserious. And a lot of times when people are more relaxed or they can crack a few jokes, it's they worry that people aren't going to take them seriously.
Right. Okay, I want to talk a little about Gawker, but before we turn to that, is there anything else you want to say about Jared?
Not in particular.
Yeah.
I feel like I've written about it and talked about it a lot, so I feel like I've gotten everything out of my.
Okay, so we'll link to some of your pieces. The Post piece I mentioned, which leads with him, the one a while ago, and then there's one more recent. Yeah. The one a while ago leads with the fact that although he was a Windows user, he used that operating system. He thought Macs looked cool, so he actually had someone install Windows on a Mac machine or something, right?
Yeah. He didn't like the Mac OS or didn't know how to navigate it, but he liked the aesthetics of the actual casing. Mm-hmm. So he ended up using a Mac computer effectively as a monitor. He wasn't very tech savvy to begin with, so I'm always sort of flabbergasted when you see there was a Forbes cover story about Jared that sort of portrayed him as the technical wunderkind behind the Trump administration's digital efforts. And that certainly wasn't my experience. And I had also suspected that when he hired Brad Parscale. It must have been because Parscale was the lowest bidder. And I think there was an article that kind of pointed to that later.
Wait, tell us who Brad Parscale is.
Parscale is soon to be Trump's second term or second cycle campaign manager.
I see.
He ran digital operations for the Trump campaign in the last cycle. He has a agency that operates out of Austin. They're most well known for doing messaging and targeting over Facebook, which is actually what my firm does too. So I probably pay more attention to those stories than a lot of people.
Okay. Do you want to plug your firm, or do you care?
It's called The Insurrection, and we do digital messaging and targeting for Democrats and progressive organizations.
So one thing that Computer Story suggests is that he's very attentive to cosmetics, to appearance, and you get that from the way he looks, meticulously dressed. And so I guess that's something he and Ivanka and Trump have in common. You can quibble with Trump's style of grooming, but he clearly cares about grooming, right? So that's just something they all have in common.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, so Gawker, just quickly, you were the founding editor of Gawker. And I'm curious about anything you have to say about, I'm sure people know the basics. Peter Thiel, turned out to be a big Trump supporter and one of the very few Silicon Valley, I guess, billionaires who support Trump. The only Silicon Valley billionaire, probably. But it turned out he was the money behind the Hulk Hogan suit against Gawker that wound up leading to Gawker's demise, because Hulk Hogan prevailed in the suit over Gawker's publishing a sex tape involving Hogan having an illicit affair with, I guess, the wife of a friend or something. And so that basically ruined Gawker. I'm just curious about any observations you have.
Yeah, well, I mean, all of this is, this is kind of still alive because the estate is trying to auction the assets off, and Thiel put in a bid for them. He's making an argument that, he should be allowed to bid. He should be allowed to buy them. There's some buzz that he wants to build a, right-wing media company on top of it. But the biggest thing is the estate so far isn't allowing him to do that because the estate has some potential counterclaims against him, which is, I'm sure, his primary agenda for wanting to bid on it. But also one of their conditions for buying the assets is that whoever the buyer is has to have a plan in place for preserving the archives. So Thiel made a statement last week saying, actually, I do think the Gawker archives should be preserved and we should study them. And it's like, well, he has to say that because the estate is arguing in court that he couldn't possibly be, the best buyer for the thing. Mm-hmm. So he's counterspinning pretty heavily. And it's holding up the auction, I think. I'm concerned about the archiving problem, but I think one of the good things that's come out of this is that there are people, academic institutions, and some third parties who are interested in archiving, just to make sure that we don't set a precedent where if a billionaire has a problem with a media outlet, they can not only put it out of business but erase it historically from the public record. So there's still some interesting stuff that's coming out of it, although it's strange to me that it's we're still dealing with the ramifications of it. So
now you were gone by the time the Hulk Hogan tape ran?
Oh yeah. We started Gawker in 2002, and they started going after Hogan in 2012.
And when did they do the thing that was apparently Thiel's motivation, which is they outed him, right?
Yeah, well, I don't think that's what pissed him off. I think because he was sort of bragging about that post to friends in San Francisco. They did some reporting on his hedge fund, which was called Clarium, which had a fairly spectacular flame out. But I do think talking about Owen Thomas's post, which is the one you're referencing, where the first line of it was Peter Thiel is gay people, and it talked about him being the most powerful gay man in Silicon Valley. That's kind of the only post that Gawker ever did about him where he has some moral high ground. So what's he going to do about the Clarion posts? They're all accurate. They're pretty straightforward business reporting, even if they're a little bit snarky. He doesn't really have any recourse with those, and he has no moral high ground to go after them there. Mm-hmm. So I understand his strategy. I'm not sure he was as bothered by Thomas's post though as he mm-hmm. is making it out to be.
And what about the Hulk Hogan tape? Would you defend that as?
I wouldn't have published the tape. I would have done the story, which is a different thing. But that's also, I'm thinking about how these stories get done. There's a reason why Gawker had been dragged into court twice over the Hogan thing by the same team, and the judge had ruled in Gawker's favor. In the last trial, there was a bit of jurisdiction shopping there in Hogan's hometown with an elected judge who sat on sealed evidence, including an affidavit by the guy whose wife Hogan had sex with. And this is information that would be relevant to jury, and it was suppressed. And by the time Gawker had gotten to that point, they'd been so drained of money that they couldn't afford to appeal it. Mm-hmm. So, you can put an indie media business out of business that way just by dragging them in and out of court. It costs money to fight these lawsuits. And I think that's the point. When it kept going back into court, I think everybody realized that there was something weird going on, because normally, the system is really designed to remedy specific wrongs. It's not designed to put media companies out of business. It's designed to create relief for, the plaintiffs when something bad happens. Mm-hmm. And so what normally happens in a case like this is it goes to court. Either, there's a ruling or there's a settlement, but normally, and with something like this, there would be some kind of settlement. And so it was already weird that Hogan kept dragging it back into court. That normally doesn't happen. And I think, when that started happening, Denton thought somebody else has to be bankrolling this, because it's also incredibly expensive for mm-hmm. Hogan's team to do. So. Mm-hmm.
With the goal of wiping out Gawker, which they did.
Yeah. And
what would you say, what are you proudest of that Gawker did? It was to some extent, it did a certain amount of just sheer gossip and a certain number of things, I'm sure, to get traffic, which has to be gotten if you're going to stay viable. But it did more than that, right? I mean, what do you think was distinctive about Gawker? And, of course, these things evolve, and maybe it was different by the time it was killed than it had been when you ran it. But at its best, what did you think was distinctive about what Gawker brought to the table?
Well, I mean, as with anything, the memorable stories are the ones that are the most controversial. But, Gawker did a lot of good work all the time. And then the thing is, those stories don't always stand out as much. If I were going to point to, like, one writer, for example, who did reporting that I followed really closely, it's Adrian Chin, who's at the New Yorker now. He did some great long form stuff. But I think generally Gawker's, contribution was that it didn't really, it was willing to sort of discard journalistic orthodoxy when it didn't apply to ethics. And it was just dumb process stuff. Nick always had an idea that there were stories that didn't get done because people just thought they were too crass or too, salacious to be treated as real news. The Trump administration should turn that on its head. It's front page Washington Post stories about president paying off porn stars. Sometimes the truth is salacious. And I think Gawker always assumed that it was. And that, even if Gawker didn't confuse something being lowbrow with something being necessarily unimportant or irrelevant in the news cycle. Mm-hmm. So some of it I think was more of an aesthetic contribution, but they were also willing to take tactics that I think are controversial in journalism, like paying for information mm-hmm. and deploy those things selectively to break stories that, were actually important. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for this. I'd like to say it's given me more hope and in for the future Trump administration or more faith in the White House, but I'm afraid it really hasn't. It's sustained my pre-existing belief that Jared Kushner is likely to get caught doing something, having done something, although that's a separate question from whether anybody wants to indict the relative of a president, which I think they're very skittish about. But
yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. What's that?
I'm sorry, I can't reassure you on that.
No, you can't, but you've provided a lot of illumination, so thanks, and maybe we'll check back in with you down the road.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.